Chapter 2. The Slave-Owning Mode of Production. Rise of the Slave-Owning System. Slavery's origins. Slavery, the earliest form of exploitation, emerged as humans transitioned from primitive communities to slave-owning societies. This shift first occurred in the ancient East, Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, between the 4th and 2nd millennium BC, later spreading to Greece and Rome. Early slavery. Initially, slavery was patriarchal, with few slaves mainly used for domestic tasks. Slave labor wasn't the primary production mode, but supplemented the needs of large families. Rise of the slave-owning system. Advancements like metal tools, especially iron, increased labor productivity, leading to agricultural and cattle breeding surpluses. This, coupled with the division of labor, separation of handicrafts from agriculture, and the rise of exchange, fueled the growth of slavery. Economic shift. The surplus product allowed wealth accumulation, enabling a minority to exploit the majority by turning them into slaves. Though primarily a natural economy, consumption within the production unit, exchange grew as craftsmen produced for the market. This led to the emergence of commodity production. Commodity and money. With regular exchange, specific commodities became desirable for trade, giving rise to money as a universal exchange medium. Urbanization. Handicraft and trade concentrated in towns, differentiating them from villages and marking the separation of urban and rural life. Expansion of trade and inequality. Increased commodity exchange led to the emergence of merchants and expanded trade routes. This fueled wealth disparity, forcing the poor into debt, and ultimately slavery. Land ownership and usury. Land became private property, subject to sale and mortgage. Usury, lending at high interest rates, trapped debtors, leading to loss of land and even enslavement. Concentration of wealth and power. Wealth, land, and slaves concentrated in the hands of the rich, while small peasant economies declined. Slave labor, being cheap and abundant, dominated production. Class division. Society split into two main classes, slaves and slave owners. Slave labor became the foundation of the economy. Social structure. Free men held rights, though women remained largely subservient, while slaves had none. Further divisions existed among the free, with large landowners at the top, followed by small producers, some owning slaves, and priests allied with the wealthy. Rise of the state. Increased social division and exchange led to the unification of clans and tribes. Clan institutions transformed into instruments of control and oppression, with leaders becoming rulers who protected the interests of the wealthy and suppressed the poor and enslaved. State's role. The state emerged to maintain the dominance of the exploiting minority, slave owners, over the exploited majority, slaves. It enforced order, stabilized production relations, and upheld the slave system. Even democracies in ancient Greece and Rome were built on this foundation of slavery. Production relations of the slave-owning system. Position of slaves as property. In slave-owning societies, slaves were considered property, no different from tools or animals. They were bought, sold, and exploited without any rights. Complete control. Slave owners had absolute power over their slaves, who were forced to work under brutal conditions with minimal sustenance. Dehumanization. Slaves were viewed as mere instruments of labor, denied basic human dignity and subjected to physical and psychological abuse. Demand for slaves. The growth of slave economies fueled a constant demand for new slaves, primarily acquired through warfare and conquest. Slave trade. A lucrative slave trade developed, with captured people and those from conquered territories sold as commodities in markets and fairs. Advancements in production. Despite its brutality, slavery facilitated some advancements. Large-scale projects. Concentration of slave labor enabled massive construction projects, irrigation, roads, monuments. Specialization. Increased division of labor and specialization in agriculture and handicrafts improved productivity. Workshops and latifundia, large workshops, ergasteria, in Greece and vast estates, latifundia, in Rome utilized slave labor for various tasks. Consequences for free peasants. The rise of latifundia, with their cheap slave labor, undercut small farmers, forcing many into poverty, slavery, or the urban underclass. Urban-rural divide. The divide between town and country deepened. Towns became centers of wealth and power, housing the elite who exploited the rural population. Limited technological progress. Despite achieving economic and cultural progress, slavery hindered technological advancement. Low slave productivity and lack of incentive to improve tools or methods resulted in stagnant technology. Reliance on manual labor. Production remained reliant on manual labor and simple tools. Scientific advancements were largely ignored in production, used primarily for warfare and construction. Slave owners' disdain for labor. The availability of slave labor led to a contempt for physical work among slave owners, who embraced a parasitic lifestyle. Mental-physical labor divide. Slavery created a sharp division between mental and physical labor, with the former reserved for the privileged few and the latter relegated to slaves. Exploitation as the core. The defining feature of slave-owning society was the exploitation of slaves, though the specific characteristics of this system varied across different countries. Dominance of natural economy. Compared to European societies, ancient Eastern economies relied more heavily on natural economy, production for consumption, not trade. Slave labor was prominent in state and temple economies, as well as in large private estates. Debt bondage. Debt enslavement was widespread. Peasants unable to pay debts or rent were forced into temporary bondage, working for creditors or landowners. Communal and state land ownership. Communal and state ownership of land was common, driven by the need for large-scale irrigation systems. This centralized control over vital resources. Oriental despotism. As slavery developed, communal lands were often seized by the state, with a king holding supreme authority. This, coupled with heavy taxes and forced labor, created a system of Oriental despotism, absolute rule by a monarch. Powerful priesthood. Temples, often possessing large estates worked by slaves, held significant influence in these societies. Unproductive expenditure. A vast portion of slave labor and its products were squandered on luxury, warfare, and monumental projects, like the pyramids, rather than invested in productive activities. Slow economic growth. Wars, coupled with the unproductive use of resources, hindered economic development. Economic law of slavery. The core principle driving slave economies was the generation of surplus product to satisfy the slave-owning class through the brutal exploitation of slaves, the ruin of peasants and craftsmen, and the conquest and enslavement of other peoples. Further development of exchange. Merchants and usurers' capital persistence of natural economy. While exchange grew, slave economies remained largely focused on production for direct consumption within the slave-owning household, not for market trade. Rise of exchange and money. Despite the dominance of natural economy, exchange gradually expanded. Money, initially taking various forms, cattle, salt, etc., facilitated trade. Metallic currency, metallic money, bronze, silver, gold, emerged in the ancient East, eventually replacing other forms. Coins appeared as early as the 7th century BC in the East and later spread to Greece and Rome. Greek trade. Greek city-states engaged in extensive trade, including with their colonies, which supplied slaves, raw materials, and food. Roman trade. Roman trade, like Greece's, involved slaves, commodities, and luxury goods often acquired through tribute, plunder, and exploitation of conquered peoples. Money as capital. Beyond facilitating exchange, money became a tool for appropriating the labor of others through trade and usury, transforming into capital, a means of exploitation. Early forms of capital. Merchant capital, profiting from buying and reselling goods, and usurer's capital, profiting from high-interest loans, emerged as the first forms of capital, enabling the exploitation of slaves, peasants, and craftsmen. Sharpening of the contradictions of the slave-owning mode of production. Slavery's contribution. Slavery, despite its brutality, played a crucial role in human development. It enabled the division of labor, fueled the rise of ancient civilizations, Greece, Rome, and laid the foundation for modern Europe. Cultural achievements. The ancient world, built on slave labor, made significant advancements in mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, architecture, art, and literature, leaving a lasting legacy. Internal contradictions. Slavery contained inherent contradictions that ultimately led to its decline. The brutal exploitation of slaves, who had no incentive to work efficiently, stifled technological progress. Decline of the peasantry. The displacement of free peasants and craftsmen by large slave-owning estates undermined the economic and military strength of slave-owning states. Economic decline. The decline of the peasantry, coupled with the inherent limitations of slave labor, led to economic stagnation, reduced trade, and population decline. Need for new production relations. Slave-based production became unsustainable, demanding a shift towards production relations that incentivized labor. Emergence of feudalism. As slavery declined, slave owners began transitioning to new arrangements, granting former slaves or free citizens small plots of land to cultivate in exchange for labor and obligations. This marked the rise of the colony, precursors to medieval serfs, and the birth of feudalism within the decaying slave-owning system. Class struggle of the exploited against the exploiters. Slave revolts. Downfall of the slave-owning system intensified class struggle. As slave economies grew, so did the conflict between slaves and their oppressors. Slave revolts often intertwined with struggles of exploited peasants against the wealthy elite. Rise of democratic movements. The gap between small-scale producers and large landowners fueled early democratic movements advocating for debt relief, land redistribution, and reduced power for the aristocracy. Spartacus uprising. Among numerous slave revolts in Rome, the one led by Spartacus, 74 to 71 BC, stands out as a significant challenge to the slave-owning system. Combined internal and external pressures, slave revolts, coupled with attacks from external forces, weakened the Roman Empire. Enslaved people rebelled within, while their free counterparts launched assaults from outside. Fall of Rome and slavery. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire marked the end of the slave-owning system as the dominant mode of production. It was replaced by feudalism. Economic views of the slave-owning period. Devaluation of labor. The economic views of the slave-owning era, reflected in literature and law, devalued physical labor, seeing it as fit only for slaves, and thus unworthy of free men. Legal and religious reinforcement. Laws like Hammurabi's Code protected the rights of slave owners and punished those aiding runaway slaves. Religions such as Buddhism in India promoted acceptance of the status quo and non-resistance to authority, serving the interests of the ruling class. Philosophical acceptance of slavery. Even great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle considered slavery natural and necessary. Aristotle saw slaves as animate tools and believed nature destined some for servitude. Focus on natural economy. While recognizing exchange and the role of money, philosophers like Aristotle favored natural economy, production for consumption, and criticized profit-seeking trade and usury. Recognition of division of labor. Thinkers like Plato acknowledged the importance of the division of labor in society. Roman views on slaves. Roman writers and figures also viewed slaves as mere tools, epitomized by Varro's classification of slaves as implements gifted with speech. Slave management. Roman texts focused on effective slave management, including training, control, and maintaining discord among slaves to prevent rebellion. Growing criticism of slavery. In the later stages of the Roman Empire, some voices began criticizing slavery and advocating for equality, but these views were largely ignored by the ruling class. Crisis and the rise of Christianity. The decline of the Roman Empire saw a crisis in ideology. Christianity emerged, initially expressing the discontent of the oppressed, but later became a tool used by the ruling classes to maintain control. Agrarian reform movements. The struggle between large and small landowners led to demands for land redistribution, as exemplified by the Gracchi brothers' reforms.